February 20th, 1943. Over Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Jimmy Collins from Iowa pursues a Japanese Oscar fighter at 200 yards. His reflector sight displays a simple glowing dot, a system that hunters had used for years. Collins perfectly centers a dot on the enemy aircraft fuselage and fires. His .50 caliber bullets streak harmlessly past the Oscar's tail, missing by 30 feet. The Japanese pilot banks sharply and disappears. Collins had no idea he was tackling a physics problem at 200 miles per hour. In the half second it took for his bullets to cover those 200 yards, the Oscar had already moved 180 feet sideways. By early 1943, fewer than 5% of American fighter pilots had scored a confirmed kill. They aimed where the targets were, not where they would be. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Major Dick Bong was about to test something revolutionary, a mechanical brain capable of calculating 60 equations per second while experiencing 4Gs in combat. Instead of aiming at the current position of enemy aircraft, pilots would aim at empty sky, at targets that hadn't yet appeared. The machine would do the math, transforming these ghostly projections into deadly hits. The tropical heat of Guadalcanal pressed against Lieutenant Collins's flight suit as he climbed into the cockpit of his P-40 Warhawk that February morning. At 23, the Iowa farm boy had been stationed in the Pacific for 8 months, participating in combat missions over the Solomon Islands, where American forces were slowly pushing the Japanese defenders into the Coral. Collins had all the qualities needed to be a successful fighter pilot: steady nose, quick reflexes, and mechanical skill learned from working with tractors since age 14. Yet, he had no confirmed kills. The squadron briefing was routine. Japanese bombers were expected over Henderson Field around noon, escorted by Oscar fighters from Rabaul. Collins would fly as wingman to Captain Martinez, sticking close to his leader's wing while the more experienced pilots took the shots. Collins had grown weary of this role, watching others score kills while he flew formation, and simply tried to stay alive. But today felt different. Martinez had been grounded due to dysentery, leaving Collins to lead his own flight for the first time. 2 rookie pilots, fresh from flight school, would follow him into battle, placing their trust in him to guide them through their first combat mission. The responsibility weighed heavily on Collins as he ran through his pre-flight checks, oil pressure steady, fuel tanks full, guns loaded with 400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per barrel. The N9 reflector sight mounted on his instrument panel appeared deceptively simple, just a piece of angled glass projecting an orange dot onto his windscreen. Army gunnery instructors had drilled the basics into every pilot. Center the dot on the target, get close enough to see the rivets, and then squeeze the trigger. It was the same principle as iron sights on rifles or shotgun beads, a system dating back to the earliest forms of hunting. At 11:30, radar detected the incoming raid, 18 Japanese bombers escorted by a dozen Oscars, flying in from the northwest at 15,000 feet. Collins led his flight off Henderson's steel runway, climbing toward the tropical sun. His hands moved automatically over the controls, mixture-rich, prop pitch fine, cowl flaps open to keep the Allison engine cool in the thin air. The interception occurred 20 miles north of the airfield. Collins spotted the enemy formation first, a neat V of twin-engine Betty bombers, with their fighter escorts weaving above and behind. The Japanese pilots flew with precision, a result of years of training and countless combat hours, many of them fighting since the invasion of China in 1937. Collins called the attack and dug toward a lone Oscar that had strayed from the main formation. The Japanese fighter was painted in the camouflage greens and browns of the Imperial Navy, its red rising sun insignia gleaming against the tropical sky. The enemy pilot flew straight and level, seemingly unaware of the 3 Warhawks diving toward him from out of the sun. At 400 yards, Collins armed his guns and felt that familiar flutter in his stomach that accompanied combat. The Oscar grew larger in his windscreen. The enemy's radial engine cowling and greenhouse canopy became clearly visible. At 200 yards, Collins centered a reflector sights dot on the enemy fighter's fuselage and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life in synchronized violence. The P-40 shuddered as 48 rounds per second poured from its wings, tracers marking bright lines through the air. Collins held the trigger for a full 2 seconds, sending nearly 100 rounds toward the Japanese fighter. Every single bullet missed. The Oscar continued on its steady course, untouched by Collins's fire. His tracers had streaked harmlessly past the enemy's tail, missing by what looked like 30 or 40 feet. The Japanese pilot, sensing danger, suddenly banked hard to the left and dove toward a cloud bank. Within seconds, he had disappeared from sight. Collins stared at his gun sight in disbelief. He had centered the dot perfectly on the target. His guns were zeroed correctly, and he had tested them on ground targets just 3 days earlier. The range had been perfect, the aircraft stable, and his aim true. Yet somehow, he had missed completely. What Collins didn't understand was the physics behind his failure. His .50 caliber bullets traveled at 2,800 feet per second, fast by infantry standards, but not instantaneously. In the half-second it took for his rounds to cover 200 yards, the Oscar had moved 180 feet sideways, cruising at 250 miles per hour. Collins had aimed at the plane's current position, not where it would be by the time his bullets arrived. This phenomenon had a name: deflection error. It was the same principle that made duck hunters lead their targets, shotgun gunners swing through clay pigeons, and naval gunners calculate range and bearing before firing. But in aerial combat, where targets were maneuvering in 3 dimensions at high speeds, solving the math in real time became a nearly impossible task for human pilots. Collins wasn't the only one frustrated. Across the Pacific, American pilots were struggling with the same issue. Squadron after squadron reported dismal gunnery results, with pilots expending all their ammunition and scoring 0 hits. Gun camera footage revealed the extent of the problem. American fighters firing at Japanese aircraft and missing by wide margins, their bullets passing through empty air where the targets had been moments before. By early 1943, fewer than 5% of American fighter pilots had scored a single confirmed kill. The handful of successful aces, men like Dick Bong, Bob Johnson, and Tommy Maguire, were doing nearly all the killing. These natural marksmen had an intuitive understanding of deflection shooting that could not be taught in conventional training. The problem wasn't courage or flying skill. American pilots were courageous, even reckless, and their aircraft were growing increasingly capable. The new P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang could outfight anything the Japanese or Germans could put in the air, but superior aircraft meant nothing if pilots couldn't hit their targets. As Collins nursed his P-40 back to Henderson Field, he had no idea that British scientists had already identified a solution to his problem. In secret workshops at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, engineers were perfecting a device that would solve the deflection equations automatically, a gyroscopic gun sight that would forever change aerial gunnery. This technology would reach American squadrons within months, transforming average pilots into deadly marksmen and turning the tide of the air war. But on this February afternoon, above Guadalcanal, Collins could only wonder why his perfect shot had missed by so much and whether he would ever join the ranks of pilots who could actually hit their targets. Dr. Leslie Cunningham adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the spinning gyroscope on his laboratory bench at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. The device, no larger than a coffee cup, spun at 18,000 revolutions per minute, its polished metal surface catching the harsh fluorescent lights. When Cunningham tilted the gyroscope's mounting bracket, the device responded smoothly and precisely. This gyroscope would soon allow pilots to solve deflection errors automatically, transforming aerial combat forever. The spinning wheel resisted with surprising force, desperately trying to maintain its original orientation. This principle was called gyroscopic precession. A spinning mass always strives to remain aligned with its initial axis, no matter how violently the surrounding world moves. It was March 1941, and the Battle of Britain had revealed an unsettling truth about aerial combat. IAF pilots, despite their bravery and advanced aircraft, were frequently missing their targets. Gun camera footage from Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons showed British fighters firing at German bombers, but hitting nothing but empty space. The problem wasn't pilot skill or aircraft performance. It was a basic impossibility of calculating deflection angles while flying at 300 miles per hour. Cunningham had spent months studying the mathematics of this issue. When a fighter pilot fired at a crossing target, they needed to aim not at the enemy aircraft, but at a point in empty space where the target would be when the bullets arrived. The calculation required knowing the target speed, heading, range, and rate of turn, variables that constantly changed during combat. Human minds couldn't process the necessary calculations fast enough, but a gyroscope could. Cunningham's breakthrough came when he realized that the same physical principle stabilizing his laboratory gyroscope could be adapted to predict aircraft motion. By mounting gyroscopes in an aircraft's gun sight, they could detect any turning motion and automatically calculate where the target would be in the future. The pilot wouldn't have to do any math. The machine would handle the deflection problem mechanically. The prototype Cunningham built resembled a mechanical brain. 2 gyroscopes, each spinning at 15,000 RPM, were mounted perpendicular to each other inside a housing only slightly larger than a showbox. One gyroscope detected left-right turning motion, and the other tracked up-down movement. Electric motors kept the gyro spinning while a complex system of gears, cams, and optical devices translated their motion into aiming corrections projected onto the pilot's windscreen. The sight worked by overlaying 2 images, a fixed circle showing where the aircraft's guns were pointed, and a moving diamond pattern that shifted automatically based on the gyroscope's calculations. The pilot's task was deceptively simple. Set the target's wingspan using a dial, adjust for range, and keep the moving diamonds on the target while pulling the trigger. The gyroscopes would handle the rest. Testing began at the Royal Aircraft Establishment's gunnery range in late 1941. Squadron leader James Johnson, a veteran pilot with 12 confirmed kills, volunteered for the first live-fire trials. Johnson had honed his deflection shooting skills through hundreds of combat hours, learning to estimate lead angles through experience. He was skeptical that any machine could outperform human intuition. The test target was a Henley target tug aircraft flying predictable patterns at 2,000 feet. Using his standard reflector sight, Johnson scored hits with about 30% of his ammunition, which was exceptional by IAF standards. Then the technicians installed Cunningham's gyroscopic sight in Johnson Hurricane. On his first pass with a new device, Johnson watched the diamond pattern track smoothly ahead of the target aircraft, leading it by the right amount. He fired a 2-second burst, and his tracer rounds tore into the Henley's wing root. His hit percentage with a gyroscopic sight was 75%. Johnson landed his Hurricane and immediately requested a meeting with Fighter Command Headquarters. Within weeks, the Air Ministry classified Cunningham's invention as highly secret and ordered immediate production. In late 1942, the Americans learned about the British gyroscope sight through intelligence channels. Colonel Cass Howe, chief of the Army Air Forces Armament Division, flew to England to examine the device firsthand. What he found exceeded every expectation. The RAF's gyroscopic sights were transforming average pilots into deadly marksmen. Squadrons equipped with the new devices were reporting kill ratios 3 times higher than those still using fixed sights. Howe immediately contacted the Spey Corporation in Brooklyn, America's top manufacturer of precision instruments. Spey engineers had been developing fire control systems for naval guns since the 1920s, making them uniquely qualified to mass-produce the British design. By January 1943, Spey had reverse-engineered Cunningham's prototype and begun production of the American version, designated the K-14 computing gun sight. The K-14 was both more complex and more refined than the British original. Spey's engineers improved the gyroscopic mechanism, reducing its weight from 18 pounds to 13 while enhancing reliability. The optical system projected images with exceptional clarity, even during the intense vibrations and G-forces of combat maneuvers. Most importantly, American production methods allowed the K-14 to be manufactured at an unprecedented scale. Spey's Brooklyn factory soon produced 1,000 K-14 sights per month. Each K-14 contained over 400 precision machine parts, and its gyroscope spun in dual bearings similar to those used in luxury watches, maintaining an 18,000 RPM rotation for hundreds of combat hours. Electric motors, powered by the aircraft generator, kept the gyro spinning, while a complex mechanical computer translated their precession into aiming corrections accurate to fractions of a degree. The operation of the sight remained elegant in its simplicity despite its internal complexity. A pilot would spot an enemy aircraft and begin tracking it through a gentle tone as the fighter banked to follow the target. The K-14's gyroscopes detected the rotation and began calculating interception geometry. The pilot would set the target's wingspan using a dial on the sight's housing, 32 feet for a Messerschmitt, 40 feet for a Zero, 64 feet for a bomber. A twist grip on the throttle adjusted for range. The gyroscopes would do everything else, projecting the moving diamond pattern at precisely the right point in space. Training pilots to use the K-14 required a complete shift in traditional gunnery instruction. For decades, marksmen had been taught to aim directly at their targets. The K-14, however, demanded that pilots aim at empty space, trusting the machine's calculations over their own instincts. Many experienced pilots struggled with this psychological barrier. Their instincts screamed that firing at nothing would result in a miss. Yet the mathematics proved otherwise. By summer 1943, the first K-14 sites were reaching combat squadrons in both the Pacific and European theaters. The devices arrived with strict security classifications and detailed technical manuals, but no comprehensive training program. Squadron commanders had to develop their own methods for teaching pilots to use this revolutionary technology. Some units adapted quickly, while others struggled to overcome decades of conventional wisdom about aerial gunnery. The stage was now set for the K-14's combat debut, where American pilots would discover if a mechanical brain could truly solve the age-old problem of hitting fast-moving targets in three-dimensional space. On August 15, 1944, Captain Chuck Yeager banked his P-51 Mustang into a climbing turn above a Romanian countryside, scanning the sky for Luftwaffe fighters that intelligence reports claimed would defend the Ploiești oil refineries. The 8th Air Force was on its third major raid against Germany's critical petroleum source. Below, black smoke columns rose from burning storage tanks while American bombers continued their methodical destruction of Hitler's fuel supply. At 21, Yeager had already proven himself as one of the 363rd Fighter Squadron's most aggressive pilots, scoring his first kill just 3 months earlier during the D-Day air battles over France. But today's mission would be different. Mounted behind Yeager's head was one of the first K-14 computing gun sights to reach the 8th Air Force, a device that promised to revolutionize aerial gunnery. The sight had arrived just 2 weeks earlier at Lisson Airfield, accompanied by a team of Spey Corporation technicians. Days were spent calibrating the delicate gyroscopic mechanism. Major Chuck Yeager had flown 3 training missions with the K-14, learning to trust its moving diamond pattern over his combat-honed instincts. The psychological adjustment was harder than the mechanical operation. Everything Yeager knew about gunnery told him to aim directly at the target. But the K-14 required him to fire at empty space, where mathematics predicted the target would be. The first test came at 14,000 feet when Yeager spotted a lone Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbing toward the bomber stream. The German fighter was painted in the standard gray-green camouflage of WW2 53, its yellow wing tips marking it as belonging to an experienced pilot who had survived years of combat over North Africa and the Eastern Front. The Messerschmitt was crossing Yeager's flight path at a 45 degrees angle, presenting exactly the type of deflection shot that had frustrated American pilots for 2 years. Using his old N9 reflector sight, Yeager would have needed to close to within 200 yards and hope for a lucky burst. The deflection angle was too steep for reliable hits at longer ranges, and the German pilot would certainly break into evasive maneuvers once he spotted the pursuing Mustang. But the K-14 changed everything. Yeager could engage from 800 yards, well beyond the range where most pilots could calculate proper lead angles. Yeager set his wingspan dial to 32 feet, the measured span of the Bf-109. He adjusted his range using the twist grip on his throttle, watching as the K-14's gyroscope silently calculated the trajectory. The sight projected 2 distinct images onto his windscreen, a fixed circle showing where his .50 caliber machine guns were aimed and the moving diamond pattern that danced across the sky, predicting the future. The German pilot maintained his steady climb, unaware that death was tracking him from below. Yeager followed the Messerschmitt through a gentle left turn, keeping his flight path smooth to avoid confusing the gyroscopes. The K-14's diamond pattern swung smoothly ahead of the target, leading the Bf-109 by what looked like 60 feet, an aiming point that seemed impossibly far ahead of the actual aircraft. At 600 yards, Yeager pressed the trigger. 6 machine guns erupted in unison, sending a stream of .50 caliber rounds through the thin air at 2,800 feet per second. Yeager held the trigger down for exactly 2 seconds, firing 192 rounds in a concentrated burst that followed the K-14's calculated trajectory. The results were devastating. Yeager's bullets arrived precisely at the moment the climbing Messerschmitt entered the space where empty air had been just a split second earlier. Armor-piercing rounds tore through the German fighter's engine cowling, while incendiary bullets ignited fuel lines and hydraulic systems. The Bf-109's left wing folded upward as structural supports failed, and the entire aircraft began tumbling toward the Romanian countryside below. Yeager watched the German pilot bail out, his parachute blossoming white against the green farmland. The engagement lasted just 12 seconds, half the time of Yurga's previous kills and at twice the range. More importantly, Yurga had fired only 192 rounds to achieve a kill, compared to the 400 to 600 rounds he typically expended in combat. The efficiency gains were staggering across the entire 8th Air Force. Squadrons equipped with K-14 sights reported a 60% reduction in ammunition consumption, while kill rates doubled. The 357 Fighter Group, known as the Ifid Boys, saw their monthly kill totals jump from 15 to 35 after converting to the gyroscopic sights. More significantly, the percentage of pilots scoring kills increased from the traditional 5% to nearly 20%. Colonel Hubert Z., commander of the 56th Fighter Group, compiled detailed statistics on K-14 effectiveness through the summer of 1944. Pilots using the computing sight scored an average of 2.2 kills per mission, compared to 0.8 kills for those still using fixed reflector sights. The difference was even more pronounced in long-range engagements beyond 400 yards, where traditional sights were virtually useless, but the K-14 maintained consistent accuracy. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was immediate and profound. German combat report began mentioning uncanny accuracy from American fighters, with experienced pilots describing engagements where enemy aircraft seemed to predict their every move. Veteran ace Johannes Steinhoff, with over 100 victories, wrote in his diary, "The Americans fire at empty sky, yet every bullet finds its mark. It is as if they possess supernatural foresight." Intelligence analysis of captured German documents revealed the enemy's growing desperation to understand American gunnery improvements. Luftwaffe technical teams examined wreckage from downed P-51s and P-38s, searching for clues about the mysterious accuracy increase. They discovered the K-14 sights but lacked the industrial capacity to reverse engineer the complex gyroscopic mechanisms. German attempt to develop competing technology faltered due to material shortages and the chaos of a collapsing industrial base. By September 1944, the effectiveness differential had become so pronounced that German fighter pilots began avoiding combat entirely when they spotted American formations. The kill-to-loss ratio in the European theater reached 10-1 in favor of the Americans, effectively neutralizing the Luftwaffe as a strategic force. Fighter Command Headquarters attributed 60% of the improvement to better training and tactics, but frontline squadron commanders knew the truth. The K-14 computing sight had transformed average pilots into deadly marksmen. The revolution extended beyond individual pilot performance. Squadron-level tactics evolved to exploit the K-14's long-range accuracy, with American fighters engaging enemy formation from distances previously considered ineffective. The traditional dogfight, where aircraft maneuvered at close range until one pilot gained an advantage, became increasingly rare as American pilots learned to destroy their opponents before closing to visual range. However, even as the K-14 reached peak effectiveness, reports from the Pacific hinted at new challenges ahead. Japanese pilots were describing American aircraft with impossible speed and maneuverability, suggesting that jet technology might soon make even the revolutionary computing sight obsolete. Major Dick Bong adjusted his parachute straps and settled into the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning at Tacloban A-Strip on Leyte, watching a group of replacement pilots gather around his aircraft for what had become a weekly ritual. It was December 17, 1944, and Bong had just returned from a dawn patrol that brought his confirmed kill total to 39, one short of the magic number 40 that would secure his place in aviation history. The young pilots, fresh from stateside training schools, stared at America's leading ace with a mixture of awe and desperate hope that some of his lethal skill might rub off on them. The morning briefing identified scattered Japanese air activity over Muro, where American amphibious forces were establishing another foothold in the Philippines. Intelligence suggested the enemy might attempt one final air offensive to disrupt the landings, using their remaining experienced pilots and precious fuel reserves for a desperate gambit. Bong would lead a sweep of 4 P-38s, hunting for any Japanese aircraft bold enough to challenge American air superiority. Lieutenant Tommy Morrison, a 20-year-old from Kansas with exactly 0 combat victories, raised his hand nervously. "Major Bong, sir, could you show us how the K-14 sight really works? I mean, in actual combat." Morrison had been in the theater for 6 weeks and had fired his guns in anger exactly twice, both times missing Japanese fighters by margins that seemed impossible given his perfect sight picture. Bong smiled and gestured toward his Lightning's nose, where the K-14 computing gun sight was mounted behind armored glass. The device represented the pinnacle of wartime technology. Days were spent fine-tuning the delicate gyroscopic mechanism. Major Chuck Yeager had flown 3 training missions with the K-14, learning to trust its moving diamond pattern instead of his combat-honed instincts. The psychological adjustment proved harder than the mechanical operation. Everything Yeager knew about gunnery told him to aim directly at the target, but the K-14 required him to fire at empty space, where mathematics predicted the target would be. The first test came at 14,000 feet when Yeager spotted a lone Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbing toward the bomber stream. The German fighter was painted in the standard gray-green camouflage of WW2 53, with yellow wing tips marking it as belonging to an experienced pilot who had survived years of combat over North Africa and the Eastern Front. The Messerschmitt was crossing Yeager's flight path at a 45 degrees angle, presenting exactly the kind of deflection shot that had frustrated American pilots for 2 years. Using his old N9 reflector sight, Yeager would have needed to close within 200 yards and hope for a lucky burst. The deflection angle was too steep for reliable hits at longer range, and the German pilot would certainly break into evasive maneuvers once he spotted the pursuing Mustang. But the K-14 changed the geometry entirely. Yeager could engage from 800 yards, well beyond the range where most pilots could calculate proper lead angles. Yeager set his wingspan dial to 32 feet, the measured span of the Bf-109, and adjusted his range using the twist grip on his throttle. The gyroscopic sight immediately began tracking the Japanese fighter's crossing flight path, projecting its moving diamond pattern 40 feet ahead of the aircraft. To the replacement pilots flying behind, it looked as if he was aiming at empty space. The Tony pilot, sensing danger, suddenly broke into a steep climbing turn to the right. This maneuver would have ruined any conventional gunnery solution, forcing attacking fighters to reposition for another pass. But the K-14's gyroscopes instantly detected the target's increased turn rate and automatically adjusted the aiming point. Bong's diamond pattern swung smoothly ahead of the climbing Tony, leading it by what now looked like 80 feet. Bong fired a 3-second burst from his 420mm cannons and 4.50 caliber machine guns. The shells and bullets followed separate trajectories, with the heavy cannons firing slightly slower rounds than the machine guns, but the K-14 had calculated the optimal convergence point for both weapon systems. 112 rounds left Bong's aircraft in a precisely aimed stream that arced through the tropical air like a mechanical prediction of death. The Tony flew directly into the converging fire. The 20mm explosive shells shredded the fighter's wing root, while armor-piercing .50 caliber rounds punctured the engine block and fuel tanks. The Japanese aircraft disintegrated in a brilliant orange fireball, sending burning debris tumbling toward the jungle canopy below. The pilot never had time to bail out. Bong keyed his radio microphone as he banked away from the debris field. "Gentlemen, you just watched kill number 40. Notice I didn't chase him. Didn't get into a turning fight. Didn't waste ammunition. The K-14 did the work. I just kept the diamonds on the target and pulled the trigger." His voice remained calm and professional, but the replacement pilots could hear the satisfaction of a job perfectly executed. The significance of Bong's 40th kill extended far beyond personal achievement. He had become the first American pilot to reach that milestone, surpassing even the most successful German and Japanese aces of the early war years. More importantly, his success demonstrated the K-14 site's ability to transform aerial combat from an art into a science. Bong possessed natural deflection shooting instincts honed by years of hunting on his family's Wisconsin farm. But the computing site made his deadly skills reproducible by ordinary pilots. The statistical impact was overwhelming. Squadrons equipped with K-14 sites were reporting kill ratios that defied pre-war expectations. The 475th Fighter Group, flying P-38s over the Philippines, achieved a 20:1 exchange rate against remaining Japanese A units. The 357th Fighter Group, in Europe, posted similar numbers against the Luftwaffe. Individual pilots who had struggled to score their first kills suddenly became aces within weeks of receiving the gyroscopic sights. Captain Bob Johnson, the European theater's second leading ace with 27 confirmed victories, had initially resisted the K-14 as an unnecessary complication. Johnson had developed his deflection shooting skills through hundreds of combat hours, learning to estimate lead angles through intuition and hard-earned experience. The idea of trusting a machine over his own judgment seemed wrong to a pilot who had survived by relying on his instincts. But after one mission with a computing site, which resulted in 3 confirmed kills in a single sortie over Berlin, Johnson became the K-14's most vocal advocate. "The thing's got better eyes than I do," he admitted to his squadron mates. "I can see what the target's doing now, but the sight knows what it's going to do next." Johnson's conversion was typical of veteran pilots throughout both theaters. Initial skepticism gave way to enthusiasm once they experienced the K-14's capabilities firsthand. The psychological effects were equally profound. Japanese pilots began reporting that American fighters possessed supernatural accuracy, describing engagement where enemy aircraft seemed to predict their every evasive maneuver. Intercepted radio transmissions revealed growing reluctance among enemy pilots to engage American formations, even when they possessed numerical superiority. By late 1944, the combination of K-14 sights and improved pilot training had essentially neutralized Japanese air resistance in the Philippines. Enemy aircraft rarely appeared over American positions, and when they did, the engagements were brief and one-sided. The Imperial Navy's remaining carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific battles, found themselves helpless against American fighters that could engage accurately from ranges they considered safe. Yet, even as the K-14 reached its peak effectiveness, disturbing intelligence reports were filtering back from Europe. German jet fighters had appeared over the Rhine in increasing numbers. These aircraft were so fast that even computing sites struggled to calculate proper lead angles. The age of the gyroscopic gun sight was approaching its end, just as it had achieved perfect functionality. Major Dick Bong walked across the concrete ramp at Lockheed's Burbank facility on the morning of August 6, 1945. His flight boots clicked against the still-wet pavement from the previous night's California rain. The sleek P-80 shooting star sitting before him represented everything the propeller-driven fighters of World War II were not. No spinning blades, no thundering radial engine, and no familiar vibration of reciprocating pistons. Just a smooth, whispered promise of pure jet power that could push an aircraft beyond 500 miles per hour. At 25, Bong had become more than America's leading ace with 40 confirmed victories. He was a living embodiment of aerial warfare's golden age, a farm boy from Wisconsin who had mastered the art of three-dimensional killing through a combination of natural instinct and revolutionary technology. The K-14 computing gun sight had amplified his hunting skills into something approaching mechanical perfection. But the war that created both man and machine was rapidly ending. Germany had surrendered 3 months earlier, and Japan's remaining air force existed more on paper than in the skies over the Pacific. Lockheed had offered Bong a position as chief test pilot for their jet fighter program, recognizing his combat experience as invaluable in transitioning American aviation from a propeller to the jet age. The P-80 was America's answer to the German Me-262, a sleek fighter that promised to make everything that came before seem as obsolete as biplanes. But unlike the piston fighters Bong had mastered, the shooting star carried no gyroscopic gun sight. Its speed made traditional deflection shooting even more complex. Yet the technology to solve those problems remained trapped in the previous generation. Bong settled into the P-80's cockpit, feeling the unfamiliar absence of engine vibration as the Allison J-33 turbojet spooled up to idle power. The controls felt responsive despite the aircraft's radical design, and the visibility from the bubble canopy exceeded anything he had experienced in his P-38 Lightning. Yet, something felt fundamentally wrong about flying without the K-14's diamond patterns dancing across his windscreen, the mechanical brain that had made him the deadliest pilot in American history. The takeoff run at Burbank was deceptively smooth. Unlike the roaring acceleration of piston fighters, the P-80 gathered speed with subtle efficiency, lifting off after just 800 feet of runway. Bong retracted the landing gear and felt the shooting star's clean aerodynamics carry him into a climb rate that would have been impossible in any propeller aircraft. At 10,000 feet, he leveled off and began exploring the jet's handling characteristics, marveling at how responsive the controls remained, even at 450 miles per hour. But the P-80's revolutionary performance came with equally revolutionary dangers. The aircraft's fuel system was more complex than anything Bong had encountered, requiring careful management of multiple pumps and tanks to maintain proper engine operation. Unlike piston fighters, which could glide considerable distances with dead engines, the Shooting Star became a streamlined rock without jet power. Ejection seats were still experimental, meaning any low-altitude emergency would likely prove fatal. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, the P-80's primary fuel pump failed without warning. Bong felt the engine's smooth hum falter as fuel pressure dropped below critical levels. He had perhaps 30 seconds of power remaining, enough time to attempt a dead-stick landing at Burbank if he reacted immediately and perfectly. The alternative was ejecting from an experimental seat that had killed more test pilots than it had saved. Bong chose to stay with his aircraft. He pushed the nose down to maintain flying speed and began a shallow gliding turn back toward the Lockheed runway. The P-80's clean design gave it excellent glide characteristics, but the numbers were unforgiving. He was 3 miles from the field at 5,000 feet, descending at 800 feet per minute. The numbers were close, possibly achievable, but only if he flew a perfect approach with no margin for error. The Shooting Star descended through 4,000 feet as Bong aligned with Burbank's main runway. His airspeed held steady at 180 miles per hour, fast, for a dead-stick approach, but necessary to maintain control authority. At 2,000 feet, he manually lowered a landing gear, feeling the aircraft's glide angle steepen as the wheels created additional drag. The runway appeared reachable, but barely. At 500 feet above the ground, Bong realized he was coming up short. The P-80's glide path would carry him into a residential neighborhood 3 blocks from the airport boundary. He had perhaps 10 seconds to decide between attempting to stretch his glide and risk stalling the aircraft or ejecting from a seat that had never been tested at such low altitude. Neither option offered much hope of survival. Bong pulled the ejection handles. The experimental seat fired him upward at tremendous acceleration, but the altitude was insufficient for the parachute to deploy fully. He struck the ground just moments before his P-80 crashed into a residential street, killing America's greatest fighter ace in a fireball that consumed both man and machine. The same day, 8,000 miles away, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The symbolic weight of Bong's death resonated throughout American aviation. The pilot, who had perfected the marriage of human skill and mechanical precision, had died in an aircraft that represented the future, a future where raw speed mattered more than the deflection shooting skills that had made him famous. The K-14 computing site, the revolutionary technology that had transformed aerial warfare, was already being superseded by weapon systems so fast that even mechanical brains couldn't calculate proper intercept solutions. Within weeks of Bong's death, Japan surrendered unconditionally. The war that had driven the development of gyroscopic gun sights ended with weapons so powerful that air-to-air combat seemed almost quaint. Nuclear bombs delivered by high-altitude bombers promised to make fighter aircraft irrelevant, while jet technology created new tactical problems that existing solutions couldn't address. Colonel Cassow, the Army Air Force officer who had first recognized the K-14's potential, compiled a final report on the site's combat effectiveness in September 1945. The statistics were remarkable. Pilots equipped with computing sites had scored 2.2 times more kills per mission than those using fixed reflector sights. ACE production had increased by 400%. Most importantly, the K-14 had democratized aerial killing, transforming average pilots into deadly marksmen through the application of mechanical precision to human skill. Yet, the technology's greatest lesson extended beyond mere gunnery improvement. The K-14 had taught an entire generation of American pilots to think three-dimensionally, to solve physics problems while pulling multiple Gs in violent combat. These cognitive skills would prove invaluable in the coming decades as aviation evolved towards supersonic flight, space exploration, and missile warfare. Test pilots, airline captains, and NASA astronauts would carry the K-14's fundamental insight. Success often required aiming not at where things were, but where they were going to be. The final irony emerged months after the war's end when American occupation forces discovered German blueprints for an advanced gyroscopic gun sight that would have surpassed the K-14's capabilities. The device, designed by Zeiss engineers in January 1945, incorporated radar ranging and electronic computation that could have revolutionized Luftwaffe gunnery. But the blueprints were dated just weeks before Germany's collapse, too late to affect the war's outcome. The Americans had won the technological race by mere months, proving that in warfare, as in physics, timing determined victory.